Genshin is coming out with a total of 3 new units, and as such, it's time for me to mention my initial thoughts on them. The order of which I'll be discussing them was determined by you all in my polls. So first up is Kinich, then Mualani, and ending it off with Kachina. Without any more lollygagging, let's hop right into the video, starting with Kinich. But before we discuss how good he is, I first need to mention what his kit does. Kinich is a Dendro main DPS unit whose main focus is his elemental skill, which can be kind of confusing. When Kinich uses his skill, he enters the new Natlan mechanic, the Night Soul state, for 10 seconds. This state focuses on increasing and decreasing Night Soul points, which are displayed by a meter in order for specific effects unique to each Natlan character to occur. In the Night Soul state, Kinich can tether himself to an enemy of his choosing and will rapidly rotate left or right around them, with the direction also being of his choosing. Pressing the normal attack button while rotating will cause Kinich to fire 2 single target damaging orbs at the enemy he's linked to. During the Night Soul state, he will gain a small amount of Night Soul points gradually over time and by hitting enemies with these damaging orbs. Kinich can only gain a large amount of Night Soul points when Burning or Burgeon are triggered due to his Ascension 1 passive. After he's obtained enough Night Soul points, he can activate his skill again to consume them and fire off a damaging cannon shot with scaling of over 1000 attack. This orb gets its base damage buffed by 320% up to 2 times if a Night Soul burst is activated, and this buff will be consumed each time he uses this orb. Night Soul burst is another new Natlan mechanic that's activated when a Natlan character deals damage, and it can be triggered once every so often depending on the amount of Natlan units in the party. Kinich's elemental burst should also be noted not because of its low damage, but because the Pixel Dragon it summons offers consistent off-field Dendro application for 15 seconds when cast. This is particularly good at starting a floor off with the correct Pyro Dendro reactions, but otherwise it's rather underwhelming. Since he's a single target oriented main DPS, I will compare his damage output for the rest of the video, not in single target versus AoE damage, but instead it will be comparing his signature Claymore and the 4-star Claymore you all voted for in the polls I put out, the free-to-play Earthshaker. Earthshaker will always be the lower represented damage value, while his signature will always be the higher represented value. Now, when talking about his damage ability, 2 things are important to mention. For one, his personal damage output is rather large. It's some of the highest in the game when properly buffed, though this can be inconsistent. This is because his best buffers are Bennett, who has a stationary limited range ultimate, which can be hard to use well due to Kinich's hypermobility, and Fiorina, who can ruin his consistent burning uptime due to his weak Dendro application without his elemental burst's dragon. On top of that, Kinich relies on consistent Dendro plus Pyro reactions to increase his Night Soul point gain. If not done, he'd go from 4 to 1 cannon shots over his skill's duration, which would decrease his damage output by about 33%. Kinich also needs other Natlan characters to increase the damage of his skill's massive damage bonus, since without consistent Night Soul gains, Kinich's damage would decrease by about 28%. While the former is very easily controlled, the latter is much harder to control, especially right now with the lack of Natlan characters for him to consistently get the max damage bonus of his Ascension passive. This infrequency grants him a violent range and damage performance of about 3 out of 5 at his worst to a 6 out of 5 at his best. This violent range and damage output will only ever get better with time, especially when the Pyro Archon is released, who will enable his Dendro Pyro reactions while also counting as a Natlan character for Night Soul burst. This inconsistency factor is my biggest problem with Kinich, as it's really what's holding him back in my eyes. However, the fact that his damage is strictly single target is another factor that holds him back. Almost none of his damage can hit multiple enemies unless they're stacked on top of each other. This is why, when mentioning his numbers, I will not mention his AoE damage output, because his damage increases by only about 8 to 15% against AoE content. Despite that, Kinich's damage value is a relatively good 3 to 5 out of 5 when considering his passives are always maxed out. This is rather low considering his damage is purely single target. While he technically cannot reach these damage numbers yet, what really matters in the end is his team's DPS. When looking at the numbers, he can pretty easily reach a 60,000 DPS threshold with just free-to-play team comps, and when deciding to whale, this number can shoot up to 90,000 DPS. While his personal damage is not the highest, and while it can be relatively inconsistent, his teammates can pick up any slack and boost the team damage to a relatively strong level. It's to the point that even when accounting for his damage variability, he should still be able to reach 60,000 plus team DPS outputs relatively easily. It seems that as long as you have Pyro Dendro Dendro reactions, plus a buffing support, plus a sub DPS, plus a deep wood user, Kinich will see success even in the national comp. In each, Kinich will prove to be about 50% of the entire team's DPS or higher over the course of a rotation. This holds true no matter if Burning or Urgent is at play. He just needs one of these comps to function at a base level. His main issue with team building right now is his reliance on so many different things to reach a good base level. For Kinich to function at a similar level to other DPS, he needs a Pyro Applicator, a Deepwood user, another Natlan character, and a large damage buffer like Fiorina and or Bennett. At the moment, he simply cannot have all of these things due to the limited amount of role consolidation in the game and because there's no Natlan support for Dendro characters in the game yet. I keep mentioning all Kinich's issues, and that's because he has a lot going against him right now. His list of downsides is rather meaty, and you're rewarded for dealing with that list with relatively good single target damage and in combat hypermobility. But most have damage that's just better than Kinich's in single target and or AoE, so his only real draw gameplay wise is his in combat hypermobility. In my opinion, it's not really worth using Kinich over other units just for the hypermobility draw. This might change in the future with the release of the Pyro Archon, but that just brings up another issue. Kinich seems to be way too reliant on the potential of the Pyro Archon rather than having strong potential in his own kit. I think that a unit being completely and utterly reliant on an Archon for viability should be avoided, since when a 5-star's viability is held in the hands of a heavily contested unit, they usually end up falling to the wayside as soon as the next meta arises. In order to avoid Kinich becoming a phase just like how Nilo was with Dendro's release, I think some changes are in order. However, his power budget is rather high at the moment, so instead of some direct buffs or nerfs, I suggest that his power budget is redistributed a little bit. Nerfing the scaling he gains on his Ascension passive would be a direct way to avoid him falling off so quickly, since it's the feature in his kit that makes him so reliant on other Natlan characters for damage. If this is done, then to keep his current power level intact, I think it would be best to increase the damage of his elemental burst in order for him to deal with AoE content. A single change in damage values to these two aspects of his kit would go a long way into making him a strong, solid character with burning alone, while also making his best potential buffing support still the Pyro Archon like it seems they intend to do. But now that Kinich is done with, let's move on to the new Hydro DPS Catalyst unit, Mualani. First, let me start with an overview for Mualani's kit, which can also be hard to understand. Mualani's main gimmick is tied to her skill, and it's where pretty much all of her value lies, similar to Kinich. Using her skill allows her to enter the Night Soul state with 60 Night Soul points. In this state, she hops on the back of a shark and surfs on it. When she gets close to an enemy, she marks them with a mark of prey and gains 1 stack of wave momentum. While in this state, her normal attacks will no longer come from her and will instead come from her shark. These shark normal attacks have a 2-second cooldown, but they now scale with her HP. Every stack of wave momentum increases the scaling, and once at a max of 3 stacks, the scaling increases even more, up to 113.2% of her max HP at level 10. When she uses this max stacked normal attack, she sends out shark missiles at up to 5 nearby enemies that deal the same damage as this attack, but it removes all of her stacks. Additionally, if any of these attacks hit multiple enemies, they will have their damage decreased by 14% per enemy up to a max of 28%. Her first Ascension passive drops a pickup when this max stacked normal attack strikes that will grant Mualani 22 more Night Soul points for her to continue her sharky state. While this will only occur once per skill cast, it will enable Mualani to use 2 max stacked sharky bites as it extends her on-field duration to about 6 seconds with a cooldown of 6 seconds too. The rest of her kit effectively doesn't matter since her normal attacks outside of the state scale poorly with attack, while her burst deals decent damage even with her Ascension 4 passive buffing it. So her playstyle essentially boils down to her hovering atop an enemy while building up to 3 wave momentum stacks after about 3 seconds and then chomping down. Similarly to how I represented Kinich's damage output, I will use her signature surfing time and the 4-star you all voted for in the Ring of Kaiba for the rest of the video. Also, just like Kinich, Mualani is another incredibly powerful single target damage dealer. Her damage is some of the highest in the game due to her lack of ICD on all of her more powerful attacks. The best part is that all she needs to access this damage potential is a Pyro Aura on the enemy for that near 3 times damage boost when considering her elemental mastery. This is an incredibly easy condition to fulfill, especially since she will most likely attack only once per 3 seconds. Both Xiangling and Dea can easily fulfill this requirement as off-field supports, as can the Burning Reaction or any Pyro unit you can swap on field really quick. However, she does need to charge headfirst into the enemy, and since she has a short duration on her main damage source, she needs to be swapped into twice, unlike most other damage dealers in in order to reach her high damage ceiling. This can be a major turnoff for a lot of people since these mechanics might make her feel rather clunky, but these issues can be eliminated with time and practice as the problems she faced require the player to just get used to her. The one actual issue she does have is that she's pretty bad against AoE content since all of her damage is in massive bursts, her damage gets reduced against AoE content, and her AoEs are rather small. Despite that, Hoyo has already thought of a fix to this by enabling her missiles to hit any extra enemy she passes through with the mark of prey attached to them. This should be enough to completely carry her through many AoE content requirements she may find herself in despite the damage decrease. When it comes down to team damage output, it seems like Mualani can relatively easily reach and surpass 60,000 DPS. And yes, this even counts for her teams where she does not vaporize her attacks. This was the most surprising for freeze teams since Mualani would not get the massive damage increase from Vape, but the res shred and damage bonus from Kazuha plus the damage bonus and HP percent due to Hydro Resonance from Fiorina goes a long way toward making her a viable unit here. However, she still shines hardest in Vape teams as these ones will grant her the largest damage ceiling possible. She still gets the res shred and damage percent from Kazuha as well as Zhongli, while also getting the consistent vapes from Xiangling. Burn Vape also works due to the massive elemental mastery boost from Nahida as well as the incredibly powerful Pyro Aura that's constantly applied to enemies from Nahida and Xiangling. Now, I have heard some trying to get Furia to work in these burn comps, but I have not been able to find any reason as to why it would work well. Usually, Fiorina and Mualani will end up completely overriding the burning aura applied to the target due to the violent amount of Hydro being applied with a lack of consistent Dendro application to keep the Hydro off. This will net in Mualani receiving half the vapes she would otherwise with only Fiorina's buffs to make up for it. This will usually lead to a lower team DPS than any of Mualani's other comps. Despite the lack of Fiorina, Mualani is a very strong unit when she vapes to the point that she's nearly reliant on it. This makes her the first forward vape specific DPS in the game. That's not all that Mualani is the first of. She's also the first to require being used on field twice per rotation, and she's the first unit in the game that requires standing there menacingly atop the enemy before attacking. These specific features are what makes her unique among DPS, but these are also some large drawbacks as all of these things will make her feel clunky to use and they all make her future quite difficult to predict. However, there is one thing I can say for certain. Mualani is good. Her damage is high and can only go higher from here on out. It might be complete overkill against smaller mobs, but it will always be relevant against bosses. But even without the Pyro Aura on the enemy, her damage can still be pretty decent, though it will take a little toll against AoE content. With that in mind, I don't think Mualani needs changes. She seems like she's in a relatively good spot right now due to her very powerful single target damage yet mid AoE damage while also being reliant on mostly herself for said damage. All she needs is a Pyro Aura to really pop off, which is relatively easy to achieve. I think this makes her a pretty strong DPS at the moment with a balanced set of strengths and weaknesses. Ending off the video, we have the Geo polearm user Kachina, and thankfully her kit is much more simple than her Natlan compatriots. Kachina's skill is again her main focal point, as along with the others, it allows her to enter the Night Soul state. After using her skill, she will summon a drill, and after 2 seconds, it will deal AoE Geo damage while also draining her Night Soul points until they reach 0. This will occur up to 6 times for a total of a 12-second duration. Her skill also scales based on her defense, which is increased by a small amount from her Ascension 4 passive. Additionally, her Ascension 1 passive increases her Geo damage when any ally triggers Night Soul Burst. Kachina's Elemental Burst is a simple large damaging AoE that scales off of her defense stat and increases the AoE size of her skill's attacks. Since she is a 4-star, it is also important to mention her constellations. Her first grants her 3 energy after an ally picks up a crystallized shard with a 5-second cooldown. Her second allows her Elemental Burst to grant her an extra 20 Night Soul points and will cast her skill if it's currently not active, which effectively grants her skill 4 more seconds of uptime. Her C4 increases the on-field party member's defense by 8% when an enemy is within her Elemental Burst's field, with each additional enemy increasing the number by 4% up to a max of 20%. And her C6 triggers an attack scaling off of her defense when an ally's shield is destroyed, triggering only once per 5 seconds. Unlike Kinich and Mualani, I will not be comparing whale damage to free-to-play damage. Instead, for this section, I will be comparing her average damage with a few different polearms and some consistent buffers she has. But for the rest of the video, I will be using the Rainbow Trail to compare her team's single target and AoE damage, since she does have relatively large AoE attacks and because she's a 4-star. Due to the latter factor, I am considering her C6 damage potential from here on out. Kachina's damage output as a sub-DPS unit is just okay. She reaches a 2.5 out of 5 across the board for sub-DPS, which is not bad but not good, just average. However, her damage is always available even without additional buffs or conditions, unlike Kinich or Mualani. She just needs to toss out her burst if it's up and her skill. That's all. During this time, due to the new scroll artifact set, she will grant Electro, Pyro, Hydro, Cryo, and Geo party members a near permanent 40% damage bonus whenever she triggers a reaction, though Cryo can be a bit iffy due to Geo's anti-synergy with its main reaction. This buffing in particular is what makes Kachina good, as its damage buff to the entire team is huge. On top of that, she offers a defense percent increase to allies in her elemental burst. While small, it can offer her the edge in specific comps. Speaking of, she can work well anywhere, but because Anemo is just better for most elements, using her with the 2 premier 5-star Geo main DPS units seemed to be a must for her. So I wanted to compare how well she worked with these 2 DPS units to their current best in slot off-fielders. The result I came to was that she can pretty much serve as any Geo replacement in these teams. She can replace Zhongli for Navia, or Zhongli, Chiori, and Goro for Ito. However, the only time she proves to be a direct upgrade is when she replaces Zhongli due to her decent raw damage and strong percent damage buff. This proves to be relatively powerful for Navia's best teams, mainly due to the large damage percent buff it grants Fiorina, while also buffing Navia to a similar degree that Zhongli would. These comps also don't lose out on the main defensive support needed for the team since Bennett is still available. However, Ito teams see less of a reason to use Kachina despite the additional defense percent buff she'd offer. This is because, unlike Navia comps, crystallization is not always possible, and she'd have to replace core units in the team. Zhongli is needed for defense, Chiori is sub DPS that needs to be here in order for the team to function well, and Goro needs to be here because he's the premier damage buffing support for Ito. Goro also gets a buff from using the new scroll set, as he can now reliably buff Chiori as well as Ito, though it does require some elemental aura being present. Despite that, Kachina can contend with the other best support units in these teams. This puts her in a relatively strong spot for a 4-star Geo sub DPS. Kachina is a good and versatile buffing support for Hydro, Pyro, Geo, and Electro characters. However, she has little to offer in her own kit that makes her good. Most of her buffing potential is a small defense percent buff in her 4th constellation, and her off-field damage is just okay. Her main draw is the new scroll artifact set, since she is the only one at the current moment who excels with it. Her ability to grant the entire team a strong 40% all-type damage bonus at will is freaking nutty. It basically turns her into a mini Fiorina for whatever team she wants to be in. This enables her to pair very well with Geo main DPS units that want other elemental types in their teams. That's her main use case at the moment, as she offers little to anyone else. However, I foresee her being a stable pick alongside Chiori for quite a bit. This is due to Kachina's drill counting as a construct for Chiori to unlock her damage potential, and Kachina's ability to use the scroll set in order to massively boost Chiori's damage. She might be in a decent spot right now, but she will most likely get rendered redundant at some point in the future. However, only time will tell on that matter. That being said, surprisingly enough, I don't think Kachina needs any changes. Kachina being just decent is not a bad thing. She's in a good enough spot right now that she can work as a substitute in some of the better Geo teams while being only limited by the need to trigger a reaction. I think that a spot like this is perfect for a unit of her caliber. If anything, she's on the rather strong end or a first 4-star of a region, with our others of note being Amber, Sayu, Kale, and Lynette. Gotta say, that's not bad. But that's all I have to mention for the first 3 characters of Natlan. Anything else will be updated for when their guides come out. So with all said and done, I'm going to get started on those. Before I do, I just want to thank you all so much for watching, and I hope to see you again for those videos. Bye!